What's up everyone, this is Dariusz Tobarczyk, co-founder of NG Poland, JS Poland, AI Poland and AngularMaster.dev. Welcome back to the Angular Master podcast. Today's episode is special because we have three amazing guests. Please welcome Manfred Steyer, Michael Egger-Zikes and Rainer Hahnekamp. We will be talking about Angular V20. Hi Manfred, Michael and Rainer. How are you today?
Fine, thanks.
Also from my side, all good. Looking forward to our talk.
Yeah, always great to chat with you all. So having a podcast with you, Derek, and also Manfred and Ryan, it's always great. Thanks.
Angular 20 is a major milestone. How would you summarize this version behind this release?
Well, I would say if I just had one term to describe it, it is stabilization. Because we got a lot of new features in the past. And of course, those new features, first of all, are there as experimental features or as developer previews. But now with Angular 20, a lot of them have been promoted to being one level further. For instance, to being ready for prime time, ready for production. And some of them have been promoted from experimental to developer preview.
Yeah, I would also say, given the pace that we had in the last few releases, it maybe is not like a bad thing if we just take a little bit of a break and make sure that these features that we have at the moment are becoming stable, that we can rely on it. And then, as I think we will discuss, then also we will then get new features in the next versions.
Yeah, I would also say, because some of my customers often ask, the Signal story started with version 16 and how long does it take that the most important APIs become stable? And basically I guess this is also a very important step in this release, version 20.
What are the general areas of improvement?
On the one side, there is a lot of stuff that has been promoted to stable in the Signal space. Which is quite important for me because Signals is the future of doing Angular. And having some of the stable APIs there or having stable APIs there that are ready for prime time is really important. Because otherwise, if we stick with the traditional way of doing things, it might work, but we want to be future-proof. We want to write code that will be also more or less modern Angular in a year or two. That's why this is really important for me. Besides this, we have now Zoneless, which has been promoted to developer preview from experimental. And also Incremental Hydration is now ready for prime time. It's now a stable feature. When we talk about promotions, we should also talk about the opposite, which would be deprecations in this space. The thing is the good old asterisk ngIf, asterisk ngFor, asterisk ngSwitch has been deprecated because since several versions we have this built-in control flow, stuff like addIf, addFor, addSwitch. And this is quite nice. We see at first glance what's control flow and what's part of the HTML that is written out to the output. And there is also a schematic that does a migration for you. That means you don't need to touch your code. You just need to run the schematic. And that's it. Besides this, two other new features come in mind. There is support for Vitest now. At least experimental support. Perhaps Rainer can say something about it afterwards because he is much more into this topic. And we have now a new feature for creating components on the fly. Dynamic components is here one of the topics.
We are waiting for a kind of successor for Karma now for a very long time. In the beginning, it was the plan of the Angular team to provide Jest as an alternative next to Jasmine and Karma. And over the time, it kind of became clear that maybe not Jest is the current favorite of most developers, but that Vitest is the framework that a lot of us want to have. And so I'm quite happy, to be honest, that the Angular team is now considering using Vitest instead of Jest. The decision was not made, but at least we have now an experimental mode for Vitest as well. And the nice thing is that the Angular team wants to hear feedback from us, what kind of testing framework we want to use. And I hope that it's really going to be Vitest. So at the moment, it's kind of really like, we have something for you. You can take a look at it. Don't expect too much, of course, but the Angular team will do a decision sometime later if it's going to be Jest or Vitest.
Are all Angular Signals APIs stable at this point?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it is an ongoing story that we started with Angular 16 already. Basically, the first stabilization of the first APIs like Signal and Computed was done already with 17, but the story was not 100% completed. So Effect, for example, and also the interop APIs with RxJS, so 2 Signal, 2 Observable, that partly used Effect behind the covers. They were not turned stable that quickly, because we needed to wait until really all the edge cases were covered. For example, with Angular 19, they changed for the second time the way on how they schedule the effect. So it was really necessary not taking the story too quickly to an end and maybe risk some regression. So they decided with Angular 19 to defer this a little bit. So not only defer blocks, also deferred Signal APIs, basically. And now with the release 20, really almost everything of the Signal API turned stable. We have still the experimental resource, but that's the API family, I would say. So the resource, the Rx resource, the HTTP resource, received this with Angular 19 or even feature releases 19.2. And therefore it's completely understandable that they do not turn that to stable that quickly. So this API has a few miles to go until it is fully ready, but already very exciting API. Yeah.
Why is this resource API important?
Yeah, so for me, the resource API was really a missing link. And even though it's a simple API, at least from the caller's perspective, it is really important, because with Signals, we are not just getting a new API, nice objects with getters and setters, we are getting more. We are getting the chance to move over to an entire new paradigm. We are moving now over from an imperative paradigm to a declarative paradigm, to a reactive paradigm. And when it comes to reactive programming, the data flow becomes more important compared to imperative programming, where all is about the control flow. Of course, you always have both of them, control flow and data flow, but in reactive programming, the data flow is more in the center. And that means that usually when we go with reactive programming, we have values, and from those values, further values are derived. That means we have one source of truth, if you want to call it that way, and everything else is derived from this source of truth. And initially that worked quite well for Computed. Computed, that is creating a new signal out of existing signals. However, Computed only works in a synchronous way. And we did not have a possibility to do the same to such a projection using asynchronous stuff. However, if you think about browser applications, a lot of stuff is going on in an asynchronous way there, especially data fetching. But besides this, there are also other browser APIs that work asynchronously. And this is where the resource comes in. It allows us to asynchronously derive a new value as part of this data flow, as part of our reactive flow. And so in the best cases, we can directly project user inputs to the outputs we want to display. So this is a really big thing and a missing piece to this whole reactivity story.
What updates have been made to the resource API?
minor changes, at least minor changes from our perspective. There was some discussion about the request signal a resource has, because it's not really the request. It's more or less parameters for the request, like URL parameters you are sending over to your API. And that's why they have now remained this request signal to parameters or params signal. This is a little tiny thing where the name is changing. Then there is another thing that might be a bit bigger, namely now when the resource is in error state, you are not allowed to access the value. That means in your template, you have to do an if, you have to check for the error state, and only if there is no error, you can go with the retrieved value. And this was also done on purpose because we don't want to have silent catches, errors that are hidden somewhere. We are supposed to directly handle errors, and if we don't handle them, we should be made aware of them as quick as possible. And besides this, another little tiny change that comes in mind is the HTTP resource that was introduced with Angular 19.2 had two ways of usage, a reactive way and a non-reactive way. When it comes to the reactive way, all your parameters or the URL have been passed in via a lambda expression. This lambda expression is important because underneath the covers, a computed signal is created with this lambda expression. That means when one of the signals that is used for constructing the request or the URL is changing, then the HTTP resource is fetching the data again, fetching the data with new parameters, for instance. And in the other case, in the other usage modes, this was not the case. There we just passed in a string with the URL or an object describing the request. And obviously, this was not reactive. If something was changing in there, in the calculation of this string, of this object, the resource would not refetch the data. And so, the Angular team really decided that this might be a pitfall, that people might forget about the lambda expression and then wonder why they don't get data refetched after something has been changed. And to get away of this source of confusion, we are now always supposed to pass in lambda expressions. So lambda expressions are our friends there. And I think those three examples show that there are not really huge changes. I think if you have already used the resource API, updating your application to adjust to those changes is really not a big deal. And this also shows that even though the Angular team gives us an experimental API, it is usually really nicely thought through. They did a lot of discussions about it internally, and usually, even though it's experimental, it has a certain degree of it is more or less stable, So this gives me a lot of confidence. Of course, it depends a lot on your company culture. Perhaps it's not even a technical issue. It depends a lot on your company culture. If you use such an experimental API, and if for you the world breaks down, if you need to change such tiny things, or if you say, well, it's completely okay for us, we rather write modern code than code that might be considered legacy in 3 or 4 years. So let's take the risk of using the new stuff, even though we might need to change something. So it's up to you. But I think it's a good thing that the Angular team gives us the possibility to play around with it and to use it if we want to take the respective risk.
Welcome to Angular Master Podcast by NG Poland. It's great to have you here. We are diving into real-world Angular tips and help you grow as a developer step by step. Subscribe to stay in the loop. Leave us a comment if you're enjoying the ride. And hey, we've got more for you. Check out the JavaScript Master Podcast and the AI Master Podcast. Let's learn and grow together. ngRx Signal Store is a popular community solution built on signals. Does it include new features?
Oh yes. So maybe even before ngRx 20, I mean, at the time of the recording, ngRx 20 hasn't been released yet, but we already had in the version 19 a big feature, which was the introduction of the events plugin. So that means for everyone who has been using the global store until now and was not able to move to the Signal store because you wanted to use the Redux pattern, this event-based architecture, you can now also use the Signal store for that. So it's also now very easy also to migrate coming from the global store. You have your reducer, you have the effects, also the events, which have been called actions in the global store, are now also there. And the nice thing is you are not required. We are not enforcing you to use it. You can use it only if you actually require it. So you can still have this very lightweight behavior of the Signal store, but if there is a need for more, then you can always upgrade to the events plugin. This is one thing. For ngRx 20, we know we got a lot of feedback from the community. The question was always, how can I use the linked signal? How can I integrate the resource in the best way? And we are currently working on a change which allows us to use multiple or to merge different signals together, which only need to be used, or which only have to be a writable signal. And this will allow us then that we can say, okay, one part of the state is now coming from a linked signal, another part is now coming from a resource. I can also add another resource if I want to, and then the rest is just a normal writable signal, a native writable signal, as it was in the old days. So it's kind of more like an enabling feature that we're introducing them, which can already then support linked signal and resource as well. But we are also prepared for the future if Angular decides that they want to bring out a third or an additional type of a signal.
Do we need state management when we have the resource?
Yeah, that's a question that I've been hearing quite often now these days. So I would say if you have an extremely simple application where you're only fetching data and don't do anything else, then probably the resource can help you. Or the resource is already enough. But I would say this is only very rarely the case, because when you have a resource, you probably also want to do something with the data. So you want to send it back to the backend, you want to mutate it, you want to do something with it. This is one thing which the resource does not support. You also maybe want to add certain functions to it. I don't know, we have at the moment the reload function, but you can say, okay, for my particular use case, I want to extend the capabilities of the resource. You can also say from a use case perspective, there are two resources which always should be together in a way. Like I have a resource which shows a list of entities, and then I have another resource which is then loading the selected entity, because that one comes with a different data. And you don't want to keep them separated. You want to have them together in one unit. So this is then also something where just using the resource alone is not enough, and you need to have something else. And this is then exactly what the Signal Store provides you. So I see the Signal Store more as a wrapper around the signal, where you can add a lot of things around the resource, where you can add a lot of things on top of the resources, and you can still use the default behavior of the resource itself. So it's not like the question is not like, is it the Signal Store, and if it's not the signal, then I can use the resource only and not the other way around. It's really like the resource is becoming a part of the Signal Store. That's the way how you should see it. And in that case, I would say for very complicated, or for as soon as you have more than just a to-do list where the resource is enough, the Signal Store will be important. One last thing we should also not forget that resources will not work for everything. So there will be definitely some complicated scenarios where maybe multiple fetchings are necessary to reach as a certain unit. And in these cases, you need to fall back to the normal HTTP client. And then again, the signal store can help you with that quite a lot. So short answer, yes, you will still require some kind of state management. State management which supports the resource.
How do the new bindings for dynamic components work?
That's quite an interesting story if we look back in time, creating components dynamically. So basically, to sum it up, we have the chance to add components in the template. We can use the router to get the assistance from the router to put components next to a router outlet. And the third option is to do this programmatically. There we typically talk about dynamic components. Our source code is basically doing the low-level stuff of getting access to a view container. You can imagine this if you compare this to HTML, just like an HTML element where I append a child basically. And in Angular, we're talking about a view container of an Angular component, for example. And basically, we can add the component there. In the past, as ng modules were a case, it was quite complicating. It was not straightforward. We needed often to look into the documentation because you typically don't do this on a daily basis. All of that changed because of the new architecture, standalone components. We don't need modules anymore. So it's meanwhile quite easy, anyways, independent of the new APIs, to have a view container, for example, and just call create component, pass a component in, and we're almost done. And until now, we really use then the component reference to call afterwards set input to pass, to do basically the property binding also programmatically. Meanwhile, we have an option for create component on the view container, but also for the standalone function create component that can be used to attach an Angular component to a normal DOM element, so kind of connecting the Angular world to normal HTML. We can, as a second argument to the create component function, pass in a declarative structure. And this is meanwhile, since Angular 20, quite rich because it knows a property for bindings. And we can then assign an array with some functions nested. So similar concept like provider functions with included features as with functions. Same thing here. We have an array. We can add, for example, an input binding function and then really say, I want to bind to that string input. And we provide as a second argument a lambda expression. So the lambda expression that can be executed to basically connect the input to the input of the child component, so to do the property binding. Same for the output bindings. We can receive the event, define the string name for the output property, and in addition also a lambda expression that receives the event, and then we can trigger a search method or whatever. Yeah, so that's quite interesting, but that's not all. Yeah, we can also add now dynamically in the same declarative structure a directives attribute, and then again an array and a nested object where we can define a type, and the type is then really a reference to the directive. So that's an API that supports dynamic attachment of directives to a component. It's quite interesting because, again, the directive then can have bindings as well. Yeah, it's a little bit hard just to describe this verbal, so not showing code this time. But it's quite an interesting API, very declarative, and opens up quite some nice dynamic scenarios that you can also use for generic programming. So that's really, if I would need to decide, beside making the Signal APIs, most of them stable, I would say that's maybe the most interesting feature of release 20. Not everyone needs it at a daily basis, but if you need that opens up quite some nice possibilities. Yeah.
What's about incremental hydration?
Incremental hydration has also been stabilized, and the nice thing about the incremental hydration is that it's really like a leap forward. I would say especially if you compare Angular with other front-end frameworks, with other single-page applications, then server-side rendering and the advanced techniques on top of it have always been something where we are not really on the front, speaking coming from Angular. But now with incremental hydration, where I think we are definitely at the very front. And what you can do with incremental hydration, if you say you have server-side rendering, which means you can delay, or you are showing immediately a static version of your application. So the end user see immediately something which is static, not interactive. And then we are loading the Angular framework, our complete application, to the browser a little bit later, and then it becomes dynamic. What you can do with incremental hydration is that you say you don't have to load everything, all the JavaScript which is necessary for the component that the users see at the moment. But I can say, no, there is a certain feature, a certain region on my page where I say, I only want that this JavaScript, which is necessary to run that one, becomes active after a certain amount of time. Maybe if it comes into the viewport of the users, or maybe if the users start to interact with it. And the way how we can do this, so this is what incremental hydration is, and the way how we can define these criteria and mark this certain region as a candidate for incremental hydration, this is extremely easy. It's just like it's just a one-liner in the template, and we are getting so much power out of it because there are some certain use cases where you say, I have a very heavy library, a very heavy JavaScript library, which only is used in that particular region, and I don't want that it's loaded from the very beginning. So I really want to delay it if the user actually requires it. And this again is then quite a big boost also for the initial loading performance.
Should we always use SSR?
Well, I said before, it's very easy. It's just a one-liner for incremental hydration, but then now I have to say, no, not always. So you really have to have the need for it. Server-side rendering also comes with certain challenges. For example, you have to make sure that you don't have any periodic asynchronous tasks running, because that could, in a way, kind of delay the server-side rendering. You also have to deal with third-party libraries which want to access certain things which only exist in the browser and not on the server, like the window object and all that stuff. So this is already a challenge enough. And then also very often certain logic, certain services will not just work. For example, I can't send a request to a keycloak or to some kind of OAuth2 instance to verify if the current user is actually authenticated, because I don't even know who I'm talking with. And then very often you need to provide a special service which only is meant to run on the server, and then you have to provide the same service as a client version of it. So there are definitely some challenges. And if you say, I don't need server-side rendering because my application loads quite fast enough, or I'm not, for example, running on the internet where I need to make sure that search engine optimization is running quite well, then I would say no. Then probably think about it. Yes, your users will always get a better experience, regardless if you're running on the internet or on the internet. That's for sure. But you always have to also take the costs, what it requires for server-side rendering, and if it's really worth it. So not an absolute yes, use it. Really be aware of the costs and if it's worth it for you.
Shall we already configure our app zoneless?
Yeah, basically we need to watch out for the status first, but it's not experimental anymore. So it's in dev preview, meanwhile, since 20. That means, as experimental just says, they are kind of playing around with a new API. Most of the time, it's already quite stable. Manfred mentioned this for the resource, that there's already a good concept behind that, and the Angular team invested quite some time. But nevertheless, experimental normally means it could even be the risk that it never lands in the framework. Now, reaching developer preview definitely means it's the next stage is then stable, and actually the Angular team plans with that. to be honest, even in the experimental stage, zoneless was quite expectable that it will land one day in the framework. Meanwhile, the fear of missing out is getting bigger and bigger because also the Angular CLI meanwhile asks you with ngNew whether you want to configure an application zoneless. We already know that it works quite well for also huger enterprise applications. So I would definitely recommend try it out. It's easy to try out. You can just add the provider. Meanwhile, you can add the provider even without writing down experimental because that was moved out of the name as it became now a developer preview. And basically, to be honest, in an application that already uses reactivity, no matter if it is observables or signals, especially with signals, it's sometimes even hard that you kind of showcase a scenario where the UI doesn't update correctly because it really did a good work defining the zoneless triggers. They're quite similar in many areas like the push triggers. But as soon as you are heavily using signal APIs, you are well prepared going zoneless, and only the normal properties risk that the UI doesn't update immediately. But nevertheless, if then afterwards one signal or an event listener that is bound or the router that navigates, if any one of them triggers a change detection run, and triggering is actually the wrong word, it's more scheduling meanwhile, then it means the normal change detection would also recognize all the properties that are normal properties and not signal-based or not observable-based with the async pipe, right? So that the chance that even if you have a normal property, that it at least with a slight delay updates is quite good. Nevertheless, the sooner you refactor to signals with the resource, with all the other APIs, the easier it is later on to activate zoneless to really maybe remove the polyfill one day. But yeah, it's also progress. We are developer preview now. Definitely try it out. Yeah.
Definitely. Rainer, what should we use as a testing framework?
Yeah, so as I said, the situation currently is a little bit dynamic. We don't know what's going to happen, but we know that something is going to happen very soon. So what I would say, if you start right now with a new Angular application, then just take whatever your CLI or Nix provides you, which means if you use the Angular CLI, you stay with Jasmine Karma. If you use NX, then it's going to be Jest. You use this and that's it. If you're already using something, then also stay where you are. Don't move. Don't do anything. Just use whatever you have and wait for the decision of Angular. If Angular then says we want to support Jest, which is something which I don't hope, then probably Jest is going to be the one that most of us will migrate. If Angular says we are going to support Vitest, then I think we also want to go to Vitest, but I also think it's not going to happen that soon, because there are a lot of things which need to happen in order to get full integration, full support of Vitest. So, I would just say, as I said, stay where you are, don't move, and let's just see what's going to happen, what the Angular team will decide.
The Angular style guide received updates. What about them?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting decision because I guess a lot of currently implemented Angular applications that grew over quite some years the developers will be surprised by that. The Angular CLI now suggests and has the default implementation. If you generate, for example, a component pipe directive, it doesn't add the type of that generated output. So I mean, if you generate a component, it doesn't add component into the file name anymore. You can opt in for that in the Angular JSON settings for the schematics or with an argument on the command line. But per default, it would, for example, generate a product component. So if you say ng generate component and then product, it would generate a file name without component in. Yeah, that's quite surprising, I would say. But the Angular team mentioned that that is often not necessary in their opinion. So if you create a product table or a product card, it speaks for itself, and basically it's quite clear that it will render out or that it will generate a component that can be used for rendering, right? Same for the directives and pipes as mentioned and those other implementations. And basically you can opt in. So I would expect that some current projects would take that chance at least at the beginning so that they have no regressions with the previously implemented components and directives and so on. That's one of the changes in the Angular style guide. Another one is that we have a clear recommendation now to more often use protected and read-only for properties that are exactly in that shape. So for inputs and outputs, for example, signal-based, they should be marked as protected if you use them in the template only. So all the properties that you use in the template only should be marked as protected. Protected was added a few major releases ago, not only in case of inheritance scenarios, but also it means that private properties are not accessible in the template, but protected properties are. And for public, anyways, we can access them. Yeah. The same for read-only. So if you assign a value like an input or output to an Angular component, then it should normally not change throughout the lifetime of your component. Therefore, read-only would be the right choice here, and the style guide refers to that as well. And also some other additions were made to the style guide. For example, we had in the past several ways, or still supported, to bind stylings. So ngStyle, ngClass, for example. Now the preference goes clearly into that direction, not using ngStyle and ngClass anymore, but instead have a binding style dot and then the style name, respectively class dot and then the class name. So that should definitely be used in preference, so not the ngStyle and ngClass anymore. Yeah. So quite some interesting updates also related to the style guide. Yeah.
The resource API does only allow fetching data. What with updating data?
Yeah, that's an important question. And actually, this question comes quite often because at this point, the API is, at least currently, not fully symmetric. In theory, you can use the resource API to also do calls beyond get. You can do post calls or put or batch calls, but this is rather thought as a fallback. Perhaps you have some existing APIs that expect those verbs instead of get. For instance, if you have a lot of parameters, some backend guy might have decided to send those parameters over using the HTTP payload. Or perhaps if you are really unlucky, you have to use SOAP services, and also there everything is post. So this is the main reason why we can switch over to other verbs, but in general, we are going with get. However, this is not intended for be used for updating data. The resource API itself is not intended for updating data. One reason why it's not a good idea is by default, the resource API is going with switch map semantics, which is usually not what you want to have when updating data. And so the big question is, what can we do instead? And the current answer is, for this, we have to stick with the HTTP client. Saying this, the HTTP client is also in the underpinnings of the resource API, of the HTTP resource. So it's still there. You still need to provide it. But in the case of the HTTP resource, it's abstracted. So if you don't want to use the HTTP client by hand, of course, no one can hold you back from writing your own abstraction in the sense of a, let's call it, mutation API or updater API, which could be a nice little wrapper around the HTTP client that is executing a command, an HTTP command, and returning some signals informing about the current state, like did it work or not? Do we have an error? Are we just working? Do we need to wait a bit more because the current operation is in progress? Stuff like this. So no one can hold you back from this. Also, no one can prevent you from writing your own resource. The resource itself is written in a very extensible way. And the Angular team is also extending it by themselves. For instance, the Rx resource that bridges over to the world of RxJS is such an extension, but also the HTTP resource. So no one prevents you from writing your own resource that also sends the data back to the backend after updating it. But so far, no official solution. The Angular team is aware of this and it's on their list. But I think, first of all, they want to see how people use the resource, and then they will decide how to add additional features into it or into other APIs to also be usable for the updating use case.
Which other new features do you expect in Angular 21?
Yeah, Angular 21 or maybe even 20, a feature release, because the Angular team often surprised us in the recent past that they added quite very nice features like the HTTP resource now with 19.2. So maybe we also receive some really big features with a feature release, because if they implement this in a new namespace or generally new API, it's not necessarily a breaking change, and therefore a feature release could also fit. What I would expect is, on one hand, selectorless components, and on the other hand, signal forms. I guess especially the latter one, everyone is excited about this, and we already saw some prototypes in that area in the Angular repository. So really quite interesting what they will likely offer this year, before or with version 21. Yeah.
What is meant by selectorless components and directives?
Yeah, selectorless components, it sounds kind of a little bit weird, right? Because how do I add a component to a template without a selector? We almost cannot imagine that, as at least from an Angular perspective. But we know that other frameworks are already having such a strategy, and it has a clear benefit. If you think of standalone components, we got rid of the burden of the ng module and of the indirection of the ng module, but still we need to, first of all, import the symbol on a level of JavaScript TypeScript on the top of the file with a static import, for example. And on the other hand, we need to add it to the imports array of our component decorator. So there's still kind of redundancy, right? So if you teach this to a new Angular developer with an essential workshop, for example, that's really hard to get. It's really hard to get why you need the duplicated import. And for React applications, for example, we can import a component, and because they also have a different strategy on how to define the template with JSX, of course. But nevertheless, they have the chance to use the class name or the function name for a component directly as a tag name. And the same will likely be possible with Angular in future. So the first PRs already landed in this area, that we, for example, could import a product component with a class name product with a capital P, for example. And then we write our template, maybe an inline template, with the normal errors for the HTML tags, and the name of the HTML tag is then not like always in the kebab case with small letters and dashes in between, but instead with a Pascal case with a capital letter like a class name. And the same could be possible for directives. So directives could then be added without a clear CSS selector, attribute selector, for example, but instead with an @ symbol in front of the attribute name, and then opening parentheses where we could pass in bindings and bindings for the directive especially. So this is then also clearer separated than now. And the same could work for pipes. Yeah, so pipes could also just instead of the name, just reference the class name actually with a Pascal case syntax again. Yeah, so that's quite interesting. And again, I'm quite sure Angular will of course, do this backwards compatible, so both approaches then will work. Likely our components would then look a little bit different if we are using the selector syntax or the new selectorless syntax, but as long as both is supported, no one needs to hurry again. So the concept that we already know, bringing in new features, new interesting concepts, but staying compatible. Angular has quite a credibility already. I would say at least since version 2. Let's not talk about version 1. Yeah, that's about selectorless.
How will the new Signal Forms API look like?
Yeah, also that's very interesting, and basically people are awaiting this. Likely this is the feature everyone is really waiting for, because at the moment the Signal integration is a little bit hard. It's also hard if I compare it with state management solutions. At the moment, we typically have a different way of reading state than writing state. So at the moment, the template-driven approach where we can reference a signal, so not reading the signal, but reference it in a two-way binding, and it automatically writes back to that signal reference. That's often not possible with state management signals because they are read-only. And the Signal Forms API will very likely have a nested signal structure. It's also interesting what the Angular team is preparing in that area. So having a kind of nested signal concept, not with really signal references on different levels, but with kind of recursive access of the nested structures, and then basically we can bind a signal to informs element and connect then the different controls to that, maybe with a similar metadata structure that we know from now, but with a different concept on also connects not only validation logic, but also logic on how to decide whether a control shall be shown or not, whether it is disabled or not. So it's about hiding elements, it's about disabling elements, bringing them, actually disconnecting them from validation that way. That's quite interesting because it seems that they also add some new APIs that we did not have included until now in the template-driven or reactive forms API. So it really feels good already what we see in the prototypes, and yeah, let's see when this will be released. I'm also very excited about that. Yeah.
Any news about a new authoring format?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, this is all high speculation, but after the selectorless components and also the signal forms, maybe also signal components, that might be the grand finale of the complete Angular renaissance. Last year at NG Poland, the Angular team showed already in a few slides that they think about maybe switching to a different format when it comes to the components. Alternative formats would be going away from a class and moving to a functional-based or function-based, or to something which kind of only looks like an HTML with a script tag in it. And so the plan is at the moment to make sure that these things, which we have now discussed, that they will come out, and then they will probably revisit this idea again. And it could be the case that something changes, but it could also happen that nothing changes and we stick to classes. But maybe just again, a few words why this is actually a discussion inside of the Angular team. They have to rewrite in a way TypeScript for the templates themselves. So this is, of course, something which slows them down, because for every keyword, for every kind of feature that you want to use in the template, you have to implement this on your own, and you cannot use native TypeScript. Other things that we also already know, especially for newcomers to Angular, they very often struggle with certain concepts. For example, why is property binding? Why is this only done in ng on init? And why is it not already available in the constructor? For us, it's obvious. We have been learned this is the way how it is. But if you show this someone who comes from a different framework, they have just a lot of question marks. The other, and this is also something which is very important, if you have a class, then and the class is now representing a component, and the question is, what's now the API of that particular component? And at the moment, we have two different ways on how to define an API. The class defines its own API via public properties, via public methods. But if we look at it from a perspective of a component, then we have to say it's an input and output. So the input property bindings and the output events are the API and not the public methods and properties of the class. So again, all these things cause a little bit of confusion for newcomers, not so much for us. And this is why they are currently re-evaluating the concept that we have now at the moment for components.
If someone hasn't used Angular in years, what's the biggest reason to give Angular 20 a fresh look?
I would say the biggest reason is it is more lightweight nowadays. The Angular team took out a lot of unnecessary weight, and I really want to stress the word unnecessary there. Because everything that makes sense, everything that makes Angular this batteries included framework is still there. Like you have support for forms, you have an official router, you have an official solution for HTTP access and for testing and so on. But besides this, where we don't need the weight, Angular became a lot of more lightweight. We don't need ng modules anymore. We can go with standalone components. We have this new awesome reactivity concept around signals that makes everything a bit more reactive, more performant, more stream-aligned, and it does not come with the complexity of RxJS. Of course, you can switch over to RxJS if you need the power from RxJS. RxJS can do a lot of things that is not possible with Signals, so you can mix and match both with an inter-op solution. But for getting started, Signal should be okay for the majority of the use cases. So it's also more lightweight in that regards. And besides that, Angular is meanwhile using the TypeScript compiler more. For instance, instead of going with input decorators, we now have an input function. And this allows us to make use of type inference. So we see at first glance which kind of input we get. Is it an input that gives us a product, or is it an input that gives us an invoice? We can see at first glance, is the invoice required or not? This is also automatically reflected in the respective type. We are getting stuff like invoice or invoice question marks, things like this. So also in that regards, a bit more stream-aligned.
Maybe I would also like to add exactly what Manfred just said, but I really want to emphasize on this lightweight behavior. It's not like Angular is now becoming a framework you can only use for simple application. It's still this enterprise framework, which we have. The point is we reach the same things, but much more efficient. That's the point. It's not that we are losing certain powerful features. We reach the same things just in a shorter amount of time.
Yeah, I agree to that and want to highlight this once again. Basically, the Angular team, and this is really visible, tries to make the framework simpler, tries to attract also younger developers that are taking the decision which framework they should invest in, which framework to learn. And that's quite important. I always tell this to my customers if they ask me, but why are they caring of making the framework simpler? We're talking about an enterprise framework. We don't care that much about young developers joining or leaving university, but it's important for all of us, right? If there are two less developers on the market interested in Angular, then maybe the one or the other company also takes the decision saying, hey, if there's two less Angular interest on the market, if there are two less resources available, why should we implement our applications with Angular and not with any other framework? So basically the way that they are going, making the framework simpler, making it more attractive, adding features, using synergies like they have in the Google company with the merger of the WIS team and enabling all the server-side rendering features by adding knowledge out of the Google company and having a win-win-win situation for actually everyone, right, including the community and the Angular team and the WIS team. In addition, actually, we modernize the framework right now, and in a way that is quite outstanding. It's not natural that someone in providing a framework in that size and that category is really caring about the backwards compatibility story that way. Yeah, that's even recognized outside the Angular bubble, and that's also a compliment. If you watch some of the, I need to say sometimes, clickbait podcasts, it's not yours, of course. You're taking your time and producing really great content. But sometimes in the JavaScript community, you have quite podcasts that often rant about other frameworks and so on. And often this was the case against Angular. And meanwhile, some JavaScript podcasters and influencers that are clearly not out of the Angular bubble clearly recognize and honorize what the Angular team is delivering, especially with incremental hydration, but also other APIs. Yeah, that's really also recognized outside of the Angular bubble, and this means something. Yeah, that they are kind of on the right track, I would say.
With ngJS and AI Poland just around the corner, what can attendees expect from your sessions and workshops?
I would say, as Rainer mentioned before, related to the authoring format, right? There was an announcement last year at which conference was it? It was NG Poland, right? So likely it would be a good idea to join NG Poland to catch the latest news, right? That would be definitely good for your Angular career and for your design decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think last year the Angular team dropped the idea of and I'm not sure anymore, was it a resource API or was this already before? But one of the new APIs have been at least discussed by the Angular team last year at NG Poland.
I think you can also see that NG Poland now has become, one can say, the biggest conference in the world if you look at the attendees. And you also see that the Angular team is attending there in quite a few numbers. So it definitely makes sense to be there.
And I guess we were the first watching the Angular documentary even before it was released, right? So being in a cinema has kind of a value also for such format. And if it comes to the content and which topics are covered, actually, if I think of my talk, hopefully. If selected, Tarek, then hopefully I can tell you a bit about AI on how to use GenAI APIs during runtime to configure a whole Angular application. Start from scratch with a prompt and use some generic APIs and GenAI to turn an application in a shape that you can really work with that. I started with a first prototype recently. Where you can generate some forms. So I gave this to my 7-year-old daughter, and she could describe via normal language which form she would like to have. First question was, of course, what is a form, Dad? And then she entered something and clicked on the button, and the form was created. It was basically a form about monkeys riding an elephant, and the GenAI then created the structure for name for the monkey, name for the elephant, and then the date, of course, when the riding happens. Yeah, so what a child would create with Angular and GenAI.
Love it. I love it. Yeah, so speaking about sessions, so my idea is to emphasize the importance of thinking in data flows, thinking more in terms of declarative, reactive programming, and less in terms of imperative programming, because I found out that this is the real challenge. The Signal API itself is not the real challenge. I mean, it's an object with a getter and setter. And when I first saw it back then, I thought I can exactly use it that way, just calling the getter and the setter. However, I had to find out the hard way that this does not work without switching our thinking into a reactive direction, something you might already know if you have used RxJS heavily in the past. And this is something I want to emphasize. And I want to emphasize it with an example that is using some advanced features of the HTTP resource. So in that regards, we get two things from this session. First of all, one thing on a methodological level, how shall we think and design our application? And the other thing is on the API level, how can we use advanced possibilities of the HTTP resource API? When we talk about our workshop, it will happen the day before the conference. We will do our quite famous Angular architecture workshop, and the newest edition, it's the fall edition of 2025, and we added a lot of new stuff there. It's all about signals and reactivity. We will use all the new APIs like the HTTP resource to establish a modern reactive data flow. We will look into state patterns with the new lightweight ngRx signal store. We also look into different operation modes of the signal store, like going with eventing, which gives us back the feeling of Redux, but also other stuff like normalization and, of course, custom features. And besides this, we also have modularization in there. Stuff like how to slice our application into tinier parts, how to implement those slices in a mono repository as a modular monolith or as micro frontends. So this is also a huge topic a lot of companies have. A new topic there is forensic analysis, which allows you to visualize, but also to evaluate your current architecture, your current modules. Do they really fit, or do we need to adjust them a bit because too many people need to update the same place on a regular basis? Stuff like this. There we have some nice, as mentioned, visualizations and techniques for the evaluation of existing applications. That means if you have never ever attended this workshop, you should really attend it. But also if you have attended it, let's say 2 years ago, it's more or less a complete new workshop. So also in this case, please visit us and you will see a lot of new and modern stuff.
And when it comes to me, maybe I also start with the session first. It's actually, David doesn't even know about it yet, but I've partnered with somebody who has been a regular speaker at NG Poland on testing. And I have this idea maybe to give a talk together with him on something which we have been working on. I think we both, I will not mention his name, but you can in a way see who it is when you look up the agenda. We have identified the same kind of problems, pains that you get when you test something with the existing testing tools. And we want to change this. And this is what this talk will be about. And when it comes to the workshop, then we could do, or there is a performance workshop, which in one day, of course, it's going to be very short. But I see this as kind of a holistic overview of all the different aspects, perspectives that you can have in terms of performance. You can also say the life cycle of performance. So we first will take a look at the options which are available when it comes to improving the build time. I mean, this is not so much of a performance, but it definitely is part of it. The initial loading performance, where we come into the area of server-side rendering and incremental hydration that we have just been discussing. Then also the bundle sizes, what technologies, what features does the Angular framework provide you to help you with that? It's not just the defer, there are also some other techniques. And then, of course, so last but not least, the actual rendering performance. If you have a lot of elements, what can you do about this? And as always, I think it goes without saying, you also need to understand certain things, like what is actually tree shaking, what does it do, where do you have to pay a certain performance penalty, and then of course also the change detection, or as it is now called, the synchronization. What pitfalls are there? What should you be aware of? To put it short, if you use signals, then you are already on the very safe side. And in the end, of course, also the measuring, where we have now also received in Angular 20 new additions to the Chrome DevTools. So this would be covered.
That sounds really, really, really good. So now we have Angular 20. We talk about the newses, about signals, about all these new things that come with Angular 20. And it is amazing. Angular have the renaissance now. And I have a question, a little bit different. Do you remember your first Angular.js or Angular project? Do you remember your first book about Angular or your first video about Angular? How it changed your perspective?
Well, the first book I read on this was the book from the former director of the division that was responsible for Angular. It was the book written by Brad Green. And I really liked it because it was very concise. Back then, I've read some criticism. Some people wanted to have it a bit more elaborated with more words, but for me, it was perfect. I still remember I was flying to Munich, and in Munich, the airport is somewhere on the outside. It's almost a completely different country where they put the airport Munich in. And that means it takes you quite a time, of course, to get there by plane. And then you need to go with the tram into the city. And there I had a lot of time reading this book. I had it on my tablet, and I really enjoyed reading it, and I almost forgot to get off the tram back then. And when it comes to projects, well, I burned my fingers a bit because back then, I think it was in 2010, when I recognized that we need a bit more JavaScript, I was in the .NET space, and their Visual Studio was suddenly shipped with a framework called Knockout. By the way, it already had something like signals back then, which is quite interesting. So the pendulum goes back and forth all the times. However, it turned out that while this was a nice framework, it was not enough because it really concentrated on data binding, which is a huge issue. You don't want to synchronize your code by hand with the DOM, but you need a lot of more stuff, like testing, routing, HTTP access forms, and there was no solution for this in Knockout. And this was the reason why I decided that I want to move over to Angular. So I started with Angular.js. And interestingly, talking about books, I think 2 years later, I wrote a book for O'Reilly about back then Angular.js. It's the book with the slot. Perhaps you've seen this guy.
So for me, I've been doing software development, so the applications that I've been working on have always had some kind of element of JavaScript inside of them. We are talking here about the years 2004, 2005. We called it DHTML before, then Ajax came along, and then we had libraries like Prototype, Scriptaculous. And this is how I grew into the JavaScript ecosystem. And for me, I was always looking for frameworks which were not just like UI things like jQuery, but where you had something like a controller. So really something sophisticated where you can write a lot of JavaScript and put it into the browser. And for me, for a very long time, I thought that the Dojo framework is going to make it because that one had a lot of the things already included. And it didn't really kind of take off. And at the time we were kind of starting with Angular, we were also looking at Sencha or XJS as it was called these days, and also jQuery UI, which was not really that good for enterprise development. And then, well, we just realized that there was a hype around AngularJS these days, so we tried it out. You could see that it is this sophisticated framework that we have been looking for. I still would say Dojo was also quite good at that time, but you could already see that the majority of the developers will go to AngularJS, and this is why we then also chose to go with it. The first book that I read, I don't remember the author. I know it was from O'Reilly. I think it is very likely that it was probably also Manfred's book. But to be honest, I didn't know Manfred at the time, so I also don't remember the author. But there is a high chance that it was actually his book.
Did it include examples with flights?
I can't remember, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my case, actually, it was the second book was the one from Manfred that he mentioned before for AngularJS from O'Reilly. And also a .NET book, a combination of .NET and Angular. And basically the first one, I don't remember the author. I remember the cover. I need to look it up once. Yeah. It was AngularJS back then. And even the time before I wrote already single page applications before we had really frameworks, not even Knockout and Backbone, but really working with prototypes in JavaScript. So of course, no TypeScript and all the stuff. I wrote for an Austrian company, a process modeling software in the browser. Back then, we didn't even have a standard for vector graphics. So we had VML in Internet Explorer and SVG in Firefox. So it was a nightmare. We only supported one browser back then.
Yeah.
So
we didn't have anything back then.
Yeah, nothing. Yeah. And then Angular came, right? AngularJS first, and then of course it was the natural decision to transition to Angular 2. And yeah, that's when everything began.
These were the days where we said optimized for Internet Explorer with that resolution.
Yeah, exactly.
My last question is about the meetup on September 5th in Graz. Could you tell our listeners about it?
Yeah, so it will be a huge meetup. It will last a whole afternoon, and also it will go into the evening. I think last time we started at 2 p.m. and it lasted until 8. And we have a lot of international guests there, like you, Darek. I'm really happy that you will join us there, but also other people from the Angular community, and also people from Angular architects like Rainer and like Michael that are also here with us in the podcast. So it will be really amazing. We also plan for a panel to make it a bit more interactive, because listening to sessions on a regular basis can be a bit exhausting. So yeah, looking forward to it. And I guess in 1 or 2 months, you can book your place for this event.
How people can find this meetup?
The best way is to connect with us on social media and, of course, on the Meetup platform, meetup.com. And then you will automatically get all the information about available dates where you can book your place. I think last time we had a bit more than 100 participants, and so it would be a good idea to book your place early so that you get one of the restricted seats.
That's all for today's episode of Angular Master Podcast. A huge thanks to my amazing guests, Manfred, Michael, and Rainer, for joining me and for sharing such insightful answers and perspective. It was a real pleasure having you all here. And to our listeners, don't forget, in just a few days on September 5th, the Angular Meetup in Graz is happening. If you can make it, be sure to join. It's going to be packed with knowledge, inspiration, and community energy. And of course, I also love to see you at NG Poland, JS Poland, and AI Poland in November in Warsaw. 3 incredible conferences, 1 amazing week, full of talks, workshops, and opportunities to connect with the global tech community. Thank you for listening, and see you soon, either in Graz, in Warsaw, or right here on the podcast.